Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to all of you who are tuning into this Conservative Home event in partnership with British Red Cross from the Conservative Party's conference site, people on YouTube, people on Zoom. We've got a lot of people I know taking a great interest in this topic, and rightly so, because we're here to discuss this morning compassionate and fair. How can we build an asylum system fit for the future? A topic that's always been an essential one, something with a huge amount of political attention, pressure, sensitivity, and humanitarian necessity focused on it. But this week of all weeks, when Priti Patel has launched the government's new immigration plan, and we've seen exactly the complexity and contentious nature of some of these topics writ large in Parliament and in the press over the last few days, we're very pleased to be able to bring together an expert panel with Conservative Home this morning to have really what this topic needs, which is a positive, productive and results-focused discussion on how we can actually make this system do what it's meant to do for all of the people involved in it. And that ranges, as you'll see from the panel, from humanitarian organisations, from people in need of asylum and refuge, from local residents and taxpayers and voters right across the country. So we couldn't really be having this discussion, I think, at a more topical and opportune time. And I'm Mark Wallace, the Chief Executive of Conservative Home. This is obviously the first event in our day's lineup of live events, and we're very glad to be kicking it off in this fashion. But I'm always aware you're not tuning in to hear from me on this topic, you're tuning in to hear from our panel. And so without further ado, I think it's right that we welcome our first panellist, Mike Adamson, the Chief Executive of the British Red Cross, the country's leading voluntary crisis response organisation. Mike's responsible for the British Red Cross's international and UK work. So he's got an awful lot on his plate. We're very glad that he's been able to join us this morning. Please welcome Mike.
Well, thanks so much, Mark, and morning, everyone. It's great to have this opportunity to have a fuller discussion about what is such a topical issue, both domestically and globally. But it's also an issue that quite often lends itself to stereotypes and stokes people's fears about a situation in a way that isn't helpful, and we can lose sight of what some of the real issues are. And we agree with the government that we need to take a really hard look at the system to create something that is compassionate and fair, but also a system that is efficient and effective. And I think it's important, with this opportunity for a fuller conversation, just to elevate the conversation a little above the sort of tactical and only looking at it through a UK lens. I'm just going to try and talk a little bit about the people aspects of this, but also then the global aspects of it, and then look at the UK system very briefly. The first thing on people. I mean, I've met refugees from around the world, both here in the UK, but also in Sicily, in Lesbos, in Turkey, in Bangladesh, in various countries in Africa. And I've yet to meet anyone who actually wanted to leave their home. I remember being in Istanbul and meeting a lady who had fled from Aleppo as a result of the bombing. And I remember asking her, did she want to go to France or Germany or Sweden or UK or wherever? And she just looked at me and she said, we all carry the keys to our homes in Aleppo. People do not choose these paths as in some ways that sometimes are portrayed as trying to find the best place to get to. This is very much a last resort, and people leave because they're desperate. And the people that I do then meet here in the UK, who, including people who've come by on so-called irregular routes, again, they have left their country of origin because of war or conflict or persecution. They've often had terrible journeys. When they get here, they want to work. I remember meeting a Sudanese guy called Max, and he sort of was so frustrated that people couldn't see the affinity that Sudanese people feel with the UK because of the long history of the empire and the connections and the language and so on, and that actually, having got here, he's working and paying tax and applied for asylum successfully. And then I meet many people who want to volunteer for us because they can't work. These people are really committed and, as I say, have made desperate journeys as a result of leaving a desperate situation. Second point I want to make is this is a global problem. There are more people displaced in the world now than at any time since the Second World War, around 80 million people. And 90% of those people are being supported in lower income countries next door to where the conflict or situation from which they've left is happening. So in Lebanon, where a quarter of the population are in fact Syrian refugees, most people are being supported in neighboring countries, and only 1% of the global refugee population actually makes it to the UK. And other countries in Europe are more generous than us. There are 2 to 3 times more people receiving asylum in France and Germany than in the UK. And then if you look at the situation in Italy and Greece, we've seen the impact of arrivals there. And we have a history as Britain, a proud history of being tolerant and inclusive, and we celebrate things like the kinder transport because we want to be on the right side of history. And so these are intractable issues. The pressures of climate change and conflict mean that people will be on the move. And the other important government policy that's come out in the last few weeks is the so-called integrated review, which talks about global Britain as a force for good and connecting with countries around the world. And we welcome the parts of the Home Secretary's proposals that are to do with global resettlement programs to expand and replace the Syrian resettlement program that has come to an end. But there's nothing in detail yet about that, but we're very much looking forward to working with her on that, because that has to be part of the picture. But we can't simply pull up the drawbridge at Calais. We agree that the UK system also needs reform. It really, really does. But we don't think it's either fair or will be effective to effectively send people back who've come to so-called safe countries, who've come here by irregular routes, because they're desperate. That's why they've come. They'll feel an affinity with them, and they may well not get picked up through the global resettlement program. And we would challenge the idea that our system is overwhelmed by the numbers of people that we're receiving. Only 0.2% of the British population are refugees and asylum seekers, and it cannot be right to create a two-tier system in which there's one standard of asylum for people who come through global resettlement and another standard for people who come irregularly. But the system we have here in the UK is not working. The amount of time that the number of people waiting more than 6 months for an asylum claim to be processed has tripled over the last 2 years. And close to 50% of the asylum claims that are made the appeals that are made are successful. So we've got a system that is not making decisions quickly, and it's not making the right decision first time either. And that is traumatic for the people affected, but it's also not good for taxpayers. It's inefficient, it's ineffective. And we think the system needs to be reformed and fixed in order to be made fairer. And actually, if we have always said that if people are then unsuccessful in their claim after a fair and efficient decision-making process, then it's entirely legitimate for any country to send people back to the country they've come from, because actually their asylum claim has been deemed to be unsuccessful. But we are a G7 country. We're one of the richest countries in the world, and we are capable of running an asylum system that works, that enables fair claims to be processed. And ultimately, about 2/3 of people who do claim asylum are successful in their claim. That doesn't suggest we have a whole bunch of people who are simply making so-called bogus claims. We have a system that isn't delivering fairly, efficiently, effectively, or compassionately. And we can do something about that. We're better than that. So the simple 4-point plan that we would have is fix the current asylum system so that it works. Secondly, to put in place a global resettlement program. Thirdly, that is generous. Thirdly, to explore new ideas like humanitarian visas, where people can claim family reunion or asylum, by digitally and getting early screening of applications done. And then finally, to look generously at the role that family reunion can play. More people have been settled through family reunion over the last 5 years than through the resettlement program, the Syrian resettlement program. we can do this. And we think that a lot of the ideas in Global Britain Force for Good, our history of tolerance and inclusion, are really important. And actually will be a better society for it when we recognise our own humanity, and that actually these are people just like us with friends, families and ambitions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that very compelling introduction to our topic and to the British Red Cross's work and position on this. Obviously, as I mentioned in my introduction, in some ways this is a humanitarian challenge, a logistical challenge, and also a political challenge. Now, I'm very pleased we've got our next speaker to give some of the political perspective as well as his personal thoughts on this. I should say at this point, anybody, whether you're in Zoom or the party conference platform, if you'd like to submit a question, click the Q&A button, tap that in there, and those will ping through to me to compile for our question and answer section, the second half of this event. But our next guest, Shaun Bailey, is MP for West Bromwich West. He's one of those MPs who was first elected at the 2019 election, helping to build that majority that the government has in one of those seats that's now famously part of what was called the Red Wall. I suppose we should probably call it the Blue Wall now. Yes, I can see Shaun nodding there. We're very glad that he's been able to give up some of his time on a Saturday morning for this. Well, I know he and his colleagues are doing a lot of campaigning at the same time. And I think if anybody is going to be able to give us some perspective on the new intakes, thoughts on this, what we've seen from the government in recent days, and also, frankly, what he hears on the doorstep too. It's Shaun, so welcome.
Thank you, Mark. It's really great to be here this morning, and it's really great to follow Mike as well. And I think that was a really thoughtful perspective on things. I can't profess to come with this as a technical expert, but I can certainly, as you've said, Mark, give my sort of political perspective on this and the perspective of my constituents and the experience I've had. And I think we can all agree, first of all, the history of this country is one of welcoming the most vulnerable, of being there at times when it matters. And I don't think anyone, whether, wherever they are in the country, whether it's in London, whether it's in my patch, wherever, would not agree that we don't have an obligation to help the most vulnerable. I think from what I hear on the ground in my constituency, it's about getting this right. And the biggest thing I hear is about fairness as well. And so I think those are running themes in terms that we can all agree on. I think maybe the implementation of those themes is perhaps where the differences come. But I think my biggest takeaways from the Home Secretary's statement this week and of the plan were, the fact that, first of all, the focus on ensuring that the criminal element behind this, those people that are actually taking advantage of the most vulnerable, are the ones that are targeted with sanctions, are the ones that become the focus of our justice system, and rightly so, because we cannot allow the most vulnerable people in our society to be exploited in the way that they are at the moment. It's simply not right. It's not fair, and it's something that I think my constituents more broadly have been telling me is absolutely something that we have got to tackle. And as I've said, it is important for Britain's place in the world, because historically we are a country that has welcomed in the most vulnerable. As Mike pointed out, back when you take the kinder transport as an example, when we were welcoming people from escaping Nazi Germany at the time. I mean, it is that role that's put us on the right side of history. So I completely agree. And I think my constituents would agree that we do have an obligation there. I think for me, I think one of the biggest things that I'm hearing on the doorstep at the moment is around the cost of the system. And I know there are debates around this. The Home Secretary mentioned a figure in her statement of about £1 billion. Now, let me be very clear. We have to have a system that's fair, and to do that, we have to pay for it. There's no doubt about that. There's got to be an investment in the system that ensures it's fair. What I would say, I represent a seat that has, for example, some of the highest levels of child deprivation in the country. £1 billion would change lives. I've got kids here that, as I say, sometimes are struggling to get 3 meals a day. I've got parents that are wondering where the next bill's going to come from. Now, I'm not saying that, we've got to be, I'm mindful with my comments here. Of course, there's not a direct crossover there, but ensuring that we have a system that works efficiently and effectively, and that is streamlined enough so that we're not having spiraling out of control costs on this, that can change lives. And it can change lives in communities such as mine, which, as I say, I think broadly speaking over the last 50 years have been on the raw end of a lot of the political decisions that have been made from both political parties. I think that also, though, I was quite heartened by some of the discretionary powers that the Home Secretary had announced. Obviously, the focus on ensuring that we work to address the injustices from the Windrush scandal was absolutely vital too. And I think the feedback I've had from that is that was positively received. It was the right thing to do. And we've got to ensure that the errors that were made there are rectified, and they're rectified quickly. There's no doubt about that at all. Also ensuring, as I say, that there's a recognition that, we can't just treat this as sort of a blanket approach when it comes to people seeking asylum, but people see, obviously refugees coming through as well. We can't do that. So there has to be a discretion there. And I was quite heartened to see that is there, and that the Home Secretary can make those decisions in the right circumstances. Of course, there has to be a degree of political trust as to how that works, but broadly speaking, it's the right one. It's a balancing act. I think, speaking probably the political element of this, because obviously this is a Conservative Party conference, I was frustrated with the opposition because I can't see what their plan actually is on this. And, don't get me wrong, I'm one of those that I'm more than happy to take criticism on what the government's doing. I think, particularly as a backbencher, and I think as a parliamentarian, that's sort of our job, is to hold the executive to account. But to do that effectively, you've got to have an alternative plan. And we didn't really see that this week, certainly from the comments that were made during that statement, and I contributed in that statement. I just couldn't see that it was there. And, that's what people want. And interestingly, when I've had conversations subsequently this week, out campaigning, of course, socially distanced, people have said, we're hearing these criticisms, but we're not hearing the alternative. And I think that's a really interesting undercurrent here. What is the alternative? Where is the alternative? And I think there is an agreement, broadly speaking, that, as I say, the system as it currently works isn't working, and we've got to make sure that it works, because ultimately, at the end of the day, and Mike touched on this, we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about the most vulnerable in our society. We are talking about people that have escaped horrors that we couldn't even possibly imagine. So it's a really fine balancing act. I think, broadly speaking, the statement, certainly from my constituents, was welcome. I think there is a sense of, we'll see how this goes. I think there's been a lot of promises made in this area over the last number of decades and haven't necessarily come to fruition. So I think it's a case of we're waiting and seeing. But I think, broadly speaking, there's the recognition that we have got to change this to protect the most vulnerable is absolutely there. And to ensure that we can streamline this so it's the most efficient system possible is equally recognised. So I think, in short, I'd probably conclude my comments by saying we will wait and see how this pans out. But broadly speaking, my constituents and myself very supportive of what the Home Secretary said this week.
Thank you very much, Shaun. I think that gives us a really good linking back to some things that Mike was talking about as to exactly how there may be some opportunities, but also some challenges in terms of finding the way through kind of choppy political waters to find some solutions on this front. Of course, while this topic gets talked about a lot on the national stage, on the international stage, increasingly in recent years, as from the point of view of human experience of people going through the system as well. One of the missing connections in a lot of that discussion, and organisations who play a really crucial part in this whole system, is local government and local authorities. And it's with that regard that we're very pleased to have been joined by our next speaker. Cllr Abi Brown is the leader of Stoke-on-Trent City Council, an authority that has quite a lot of experience of playing its part in this system. She is, of course, also a local politician and somebody who, much like Shaun, has a great deal, therefore, of contact and conversation, discussion with residents. And I said at the outset of this event that we want to try to talk about this issue in the round. So from a fiscal perspective, a political perspective, logistical, humanitarian, and you cannot have that discussion realistically without hearing proper representation and voice from local government. So thank you for joining us, and over to you, Abi.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm Cllr Abi Brown. I'm leader of Stoke-on-Trent City Council. I would say that we were one of the first blue bricks in the red wall. We took partial control of Stoke-on-Trent City Council in 2015, and we returned our first Conservative MP in the city in 2017, my friend and colleague Jack Brereton. And since 2019, it's been a Conservative-led authority, and I have 3 Conservative MPs. However, as Mark has said, there's a practical reality here around the system. And hopefully I'll give you an element of what that means for me as local government leader from a local government point of view, but also as a compassionate Conservative. This is hugely divisive sometimes within our party, and I know even within my group on the council there are varying views around what we should do. To give you a little bit of background, I guess Stoke-on-Trent is a medium-sized city within the North West Midlands, and we have a population of just over 250,000 people. We're one of 7 areas within the West Midlands who are a dispersal area. There is an 8th, Herefordshire. However, Herefordshire have not to date taken any asylum seekers. It was a historical opt-in, and probably not a surprise that those areas within the West Midlands that are part of this are inner city areas. The Home Office does have the ability to mandate other authorities to join. That's not a power that the Home Secretary has, I understand, ever used. So Herefordshire joined it a few years ago. However, obviously the appeal of inner cities is that we have low-cost housing, and unsurprisingly, the procurers and providers of asylum dispersal, it's much cheaper to come and find a cheap terraced house in Stoke-on-Trent than it is probably in very nice leafy green Herefordshire. There is an element of local government involvement, and there is an element of local and national engagement around the system that happens through strategic migration partnerships. However, my experience of this, and we elect somebody to represent us on a regional basis across our authorities, is that it's quite ad hoc. There's a lack of regularity around it, which means it's quite difficult sometimes from a local government point of view to actually engage in a way that means we're able to iron out the challenges that are no different whether you're in Stoke-on-Trent to any of the other authorities that are a migration dispersal area. There are, though, perhaps, to get, I guess, into the detail around this, a few broad principles that many people, I think, are not actually aware of what underpins the system. So although we are opted in to this as a local authority, there's actually no money that's directly attached to the system. I don't get any money in my budget that comes as a result of us being a dispersal area. We do get an element of support around this, and we have engagement through the providers. The provider for our area is Serco, who we have the most to do with. We have the engagement through our strategic migration partnership, which gives us an element of officials and people who advocate on our behalf, both as an individual local authority, but also collectively on behalf of our region. And they do a really good job doing that, and they are funded by the government. We also, though, on a very direct level, have input on suitability of accommodation within the city. So we're contacted if Serco are looking to procure a particular location, they will contact us and ask us about whether that is suitable, the area is suitable, or if there are issues within there, and there's an agreed kind of criteria around what we can object around. We also have a broad agreement on ratios, and the ratio at the moment is 1 to 200 ratio across the city. The ratios in Stoke-on-Trent are really what actually raised this as an issue for us as a local authority, having been a dispersal area for a number of years. And clearly, I suspect, like many other areas, it is talked about on the doorstep, but it was the ratios issue that really raised it onto my political agenda, and has meant that it's one of the areas that I'm actually very heavily involved with now as a result. And it came to the fore in 2019. The levels were so high within Stoke-on-Trent that we were actually being talked about nationally around the concern for the level of ratios within the system. And I guess probably this is a good point to talk a little bit about my city. It's a post-industrial city, medium size. I think it's the best place in the world, and I'm incredibly proud to be the leader. We're a really friendly place, and I know lots of places say that they're really friendly, but we would say that we were especially friendly in Stoke-on-Trent. It is the sort of place where you strike up a conversation with somebody as you're doing your shopping. People talk to you at the bus stop and on the bus, and there is often a very welcoming approach for everyone. We have an element of diversity within our city and lots of different communities here, but we also have well-known challenges around extremism, both left and right. 10 years ago, we had 9 BNP councillors within Stoke-on-Trent, one of the highest numbers within the whole of the UK. And to the other extreme, the perpetrator of the Fishmongers Hall atrocity a couple of years ago actually grew up within Stoke-on-Trent. So we're a city that has well-known challenges around extremism, again, something that I'm very well aware of, and we remain a prevent priority area. However, I'm even more incredibly proud that Stoke-on-Trent is actually officially the kindest place in the UK. So I think that hopefully gives you a bit of a backdrop to what my city's like, and that this discussion is not a one-dimensional one around not wanting to have people come here who weren't born within the boundaries of the city. The media's view often in my city is that it's a really poor place. The pictures tend to be of broken windows, bottle kilns, which are historic landmark as a city that built its fortunes on the ceramic industry. But actually, like many other cities, we're one of huge contrasts. We have affluent areas, we have aspirant areas, and we have some areas that I guess, if I could politely call, as being in need of elevation. But as a result, obviously, the focus for dispersal tends to be in those poorer areas where the properties are highest, and as a result, the ratios are the highest. The citywide agreement is 1 in 200, but actually we have some areas now within Stoke-on-Trent where we're actually well over that. And across the city today, 1 in 250 people within Stoke-on-Trent are actually an asylum seeker. Last year, we became aware of the government's plans around Operation Oak, and we know that the highest proportion of those people who are currently in hotels across the country are likely to come to the West Midlands as an area. And clearly, I'm very concerned about the challenges that will pose for my city. The procurement that is carried out by Serco involves a tight turnaround, even tighter than it was before in terms of suitability of accommodation. And the normal reasons that we would have given for areas not being appropriate, community or racial tensions, are actually now being appealed against on an almost universal basis. This is on top of the pressures that my officers face anyway, and this is not the forum for me to rehearse the challenges of local government finance, but clearly, it's very tricky for us to try and navigate a way through when actually we can't even keep up with the requests that come into us. So the challenge, I guess, for me, and summing up, as a local government leader, is how I do the right thing for my city. I'm really proud of, and I actually built my political reputation on ensuring that we provide support for the most vulnerable within our city, whether that's homeless, whether it's asylum seekers, or actually whether it's addressing other issues that we face as a post-industrial city. And whilst I really welcome the government's acknowledgement of the issue around this, what I want to know is whether it actually addresses the practical realities that I have to face every day here in Stoke-on-Trent around applications that come in for accommodation, around racial tensions and other challenges that we have. I think what we would really like to see, what I certainly would like to see as a leader in an area of dispersal, is that the government also uses its powers to create parity and equality. I completely understand why no leader in another authority would put their hand up now and say, please let me be a dispersal area. But the challenge that continues to deliver on a national level is that those authorities who've already taken their fair share continue to take more than their fair share. And perhaps more pointedly for us as a political party, what that means, because increasingly those authorities were initially Labour, but now certainly out of those within the West Midlands, a number of us are Conservative. And how do we deal with that on a political level? It gives me no pleasure to attack my own government on this issue. But actually, I think there's a huge area to be addressed around how we do place ourselves increasingly in red wall areas as being the party of compassion and support for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby. I think that gives, as well as a fantastic and warm pen portrait of Stoke-on-Trent and your own personal passion for the area, it gives us a really good tour through some of the, exactly what I talked about earlier, those practical complexities, the vital role that local government plays in this, and whether that's properly being heard and recognised or not. I think all of those contributions set the stage for our final panellist, Ahmad Al-Rashid. Ahmad is originally from Syria. He studied English literature at Aleppo University between 2009 and 2012. As the security situation deteriorated in Syria, he was forced to flee to the Kurdistan region of Iraq in early 2013. And in early 2015, he was forced to flee Iraq due to the deterioration of the security situation there. And he's lived in the UK since. Some viewers will be familiar with his personal experience and his journey, which was documented in part in the BBC show Exodus, Our Journey. And obviously, none of this conversation would possibly be complete without properly reflecting the fact that we're not just talking about a policy area or a series of white papers that emanate from government departments or budget lines or logistical challenges or political conversations on the doorstep, but fundamentally on the human experience of people who need and use the current system. So we're very fortunate that he's here to give us some insight from his experience and perspective. Over to you, Ahmad.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much for fellow panelists for all their valuable contributions. As you mentioned, my name is Ahmad Al-Rashid. Back in 2011, I was a student. I was doing my BA in English Language and Literature. I had, huge hopes and dreams. Aleppo at that time was not quite different, I would say, from London or from Birmingham or from Stoke-on-Trent. People were after their daily lives until the movement started in Syria. And it started with people, hoping that things, will change for better. But unfortunately, since then, the situation has deteriorated and that hope turned into a nightmare. And I remember the moment when the attack happened in my town in eastern Aleppo. I had to move out without saying goodbye to my family because the attack happened suddenly. And at that time, the destination was Iraqi Kurdistan because the hope was this might be a matter of days, perhaps weeks, until I'm able to go back to my family, to my friends, to my loved ones. And today, it's almost 8 years since I left without saying a goodbye. And as I said, at that time, I worked with many people, Syrians and non-Syrians, living in some of the most difficult places in refugee camps. I remember children, living in tents. During the summer, it was about 50 degrees, scorcher. During the summer, -10 in Iraqi Kurdistan. And most of these people did not want to leave their homes, and still Iraqi Kurdistan was a destination for me. And until ISIS hit, and there I witnessed some of the most brutal, attacks on women and children, sexual violence. And it was at that point that I decided that that I need to move out of the region until the situation, improves. And this was the journey for me when I decided to move on, and I ended up here in the UK back in 2015. And again, I went through the process. The process of asylum was a very comprehensive one. I was detained. I was kept for some time at Yarlswood Detention Facility to establish my claim. And I have to say, from day one, from the first moment I landed in this country, when I was detained by the police, I was welcomed, I was helped and supported. And after a short period, I was granted the status because there was a legitimate claim. My family later on joined me on a family reunion visa. I was quite grateful for that. And then after that, I would also say that I was granted a scholarship here at the University of London, and I started doing my master's. Soon after that, I was also offered a full-time employment, which gave me, the opportunity to give back to the country that helped and supported me. And since then, since 2017, I've been working with lots of asylum seekers and refugees. The vast majority, I would say, of these people did not want to leave their homes. One of the particular groups that I've been working with since 2017 has been fellow Syrians who came here under the Vulnerable People Resettlement Scheme, which I have to say was a flagship scheme launched by, as you might know, I'm sure you know, David Cameron, which gave the opportunity to over 20,000 Syrian people, gave them the opportunity to rebuild their lives. But I have to say, again, if you look at this scheme, it's an incredible scheme, and it was mainly led by local authorities and local help or local support groups. But the reality is, you look at the complexity of this matter. This is a very complex matter. In the neighboring countries in Syria, in places like Lebanon, you've got almost 20% of the population who are Syrian refugees. In places like Turkey, over 3.5 million people. And as I said in the beginning of this, people did not want to leave. A small, tiny, minority of Syrians made it to Europe, and a tiny fraction of them made it to the United Kingdom. So the challenge, the difficulty lays back in the region. And I think if you look at the UK today, global Britain in 2021, I think these are complex issues that require, leadership. And I think the UK will and definitely will have a huge say in this in terms of, the asylum, the help and support that's being provided to Syrians, the region, and perhaps other places. And one of the concerns that I have recently was when I heard about the cuts because, to the international aid, which I think it's a bit concerning for me, because this goes to schools, to children, to women, to water, to food. And if you're living in a refugee camp and you suddenly told that you cannot go back to your home, you are unable to go to school, you do not have food, you have to move. This is like a human nature. You need to move to a place where you can live, for you to survive. And it's a human nature that we move for the sake of survival, but also we need to thrive. And I have to say, overall, my own experience here in the UK in the past 5 years, over 5 years, has been one quite positive, as I have to say, because first of all, I had some sort of English which helped me, but I think other people still would require quite a lot of help. Language, investment in the language in the ESOL is quite vital. If we want to help people rebuild their life, it starts with language. Language is key. The other thing also is employment. Employment is vital, allowing people the opportunity to work, some sort of work, volunteer. This will also help them. And I believe this is a win situation for everybody. And also being mindful of the fact that lots of people still need lots of help with support in terms of their mental health, their mental well-being because of the trauma that they have been through. And I have to say, overall, my own experience here, I've got two little girls here. They arrived in 2016. They arrived, one was 5 months, the other was 2 years. And for now, for them, the UK is their home. You know, where we live now is our home. We're rebuilding our lives, and we are grateful for this opportunity. My only concern is that under these proposed plans, I would have been punished. I would have been punished because I did not have the opportunity. I wouldn't have the option to get resettled. I mean, there are other means perhaps could be explored, like as Mike mentioned, family reunion is a great way as a complementary pathway. You also have humanitarian visas. We also have student visas, like for the refugees. These are all options that we can help and support those who are fleeing some of the most brutal conflicts in the world. And I'm sure, and as I reiterate, that the UK has been quite welcoming to me. This has been the experience of the vast majority of Syrians and others that I've seen. And I hope that this generosity and this compassion will continue.
Thank you very much for that. And that really helps to complete our picture from the panel discussion and to give a real insight into your personal experience, but also emblematic of the experience of many others. We've got, I think, just about 25 minutes for audience questions and some panel discussion. One of the benefits of being an event chair is that I get to barge in and put myself at the top of the queue and ask questions that I'd like to ask first. So I'm going to go and do that, quite frankly. In the meantime, if members of the audience would like to press the Q&A button, type your questions in, they'll come through to me here at Conservative Home, and we'll get those into the discussion. So please do keep doing that. The first thing I wanted to ask, two themes I think we've heard from several of the contributions. Firstly, obviously, the question of limited resources. And secondly, the fact that there are multiple different types of resettlement, types of access, and also many different personal stories from different people who find themselves using the asylum system. When you've got those limited resources, is there a case to say, as I seem to recall David Cameron made this part of his pitch on the resettlement scheme, that the UK should focus its resources on the absolutely most vulnerable and most in need, often meaning people in the region, rather than, for example, some of the criticisms of the system in the past have been that people who can actually reach the UK directly, for example, through channel crossings, perhaps started their journey with more resources or more physical capacity. How do we balance that question of fairness and effective allocation of resources? Mike, would you like to come in on that?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, the first thing in terms of balancing resources is, and some of the the points I really appreciate that actually all the panelists made, and also that Shaun made. The charity begins at home, but it doesn't end there, and we're in a interdependent world, which is what the whole integrated review and the Global Britain as a Force for Good recognises, and these types of problems, these types of challenges have faced the world for many centuries, haven't they? Where people have been forced to move as a result of war and conflict and persecution. And the problem with the resettlement programs is exactly as Ahmad says, it doesn't pick up people who come from countries that aren't part of the resettlement plans or whatever. I met a young man from Eritrea who was fleeing because actually he was, because of the child soldiering that was actually being, he was going to be caught up in. And actually, what was he supposed to do? He kind of, yes, he moved. But the other thing to bear in mind is that nearly half the people who moved, I know there's a caricature of this is all young men and so on, but actually close to half the people on the move are actually women and children who are coming by irregular routes. So we absolutely support the commitment of government and the track record of government actually in investing in support to people in neighbouring countries who are displaced. And that's why we very much regret the cuts in the aid budget, because actually that was a very important symbol of the soft power of Britain and actually our humanitarian and compassionate credentials. But the key thing is you have to provide support at every stage along a journey. So, and as the Red Cross, we face this challenge. We provide support in the country where a conflict's taking place, in the neighbouring regions, and then increasingly what we try to do is ensure that people who are on the journeys have information and practical support, so they can make good decisions about whether to continue. It's not for us as the Red Cross to say whether they should make the journey, but they're not always well informed about what lies ahead of them. So we want to improve that. And then at the point they get here, then actually we need to assess their claim fairly. So, and the problem isn't going to go away. That's the thing. We need to get used to this being part of the world we're in, and we need to listen to stories like Ahmad's and actually use language that is inclusive. The hard language hardens hearts, and we lose sight of the fact that these are people. They're people just like us. And so, yes, focus on the most vulnerable in camps and so on, countries next to where conflict zones are, but don't lose sight of our common humanity and towards the people who are also on the move and feel they have no obligation, and they will come anyway. It's not the whole issue of pull factors is a myth. They leave because they're desperate. They don't leave because they think actually there's a better benefit system here. That's not the driver.
Shaun, do you want to give your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complex one, really. I think ultimately, we've got to. It comes down to a question, I suppose, of how we judge the fairness of allocating those resources. And I think, I agree with quite a bit of what Mike's said. How ultimately, I suppose I haven't really got an answer that can come out and say, well, we should adopt this particular formula, that particular formula as to how we deal with this. I think ultimately, at the core of this, again, we've got to remember that it is people at the heart of it. And I don't want to sound like I'm repeating a record, but I think we've got to hammer that home, because we do get lost in the harsher sort of policy debate around this. I think the point that was touched on, obviously, as we said, around aid as well, and where that aid budget's going, I think is obviously the debates around the cut to that. I think that's one way that we sort of look at this and think, okay, how do we balance that? I mean, it is, for me, it's a question that I would struggle to answer, if I'm being completely honest with you. I don't feel that I've got the answers in terms of how we share that efficiency out there. I think it's something that we have to be pragmatic about. I think it's a situational approach. I think it's one we have to assess on merit. And I think it requires us as a nation to have a degree of what I'd almost call international emotional intelligence, really, that sense of assessing situations and, reading beyond that headline and actually looking into them to see how then we allocate that resource for the best solution for the people on the ground. So, as I say, I'm not going to sit here and try and give some sort of formulaic answer, because I haven't got one. I think ultimately it's more about an approach, and I think we've got to be much more nuanced in the approach we take when assessing these situations.
Ahmad. Ahmad?
Yes, I mean, I agree. Like what Mark and also Shaun said, that this is a complex issue. There's no black and white. There's no right. It is complex. It is complicated, and so indeed charity begins at home, but it does not end there. I mean, a simple example of this, if you do not get involved in things get worse. What happens in Syria will have some sort of impact in the UK. We've seen the example of Syria. People remain silent for a bit, until it's exploded and suddenly everyone wanted to help and support with this, but it spilled out of control. I suppose my key point here would be on the proposal that kind of criminalizing the way people arrive here. I believe, as a human being, I think it should be fair that the decision should be based on case by case that the individual would present, not on the way they arrived here. And we already, as I said, we have a system for this. Because if you look at the case of Syria, for instance, I hear this quite a lot, or get asked why only we see young people fleeing this country. For example, always see them in the pictures in the media. And there's a very basic reason for this. Like if you look in the conflict in Syria, for instance, most of the fighting or most of those parties involved in that conflict, they are after young people because they are in the fighting age. So they are not after women and children. And the other thing also is, which is I think I would argue, is that you have some of the most entrepreneurial, some of the most resilient, who defy everything, who defy every odds and carry on with their journeys in the hope to rebuild their lives. And this is something I've worked with lots of Syrians who came here in the UK and now they're rebuilding their lives, and they are contributing to their country, or to their the country that hosts them. So it is a complicated issue. It's a complex issue, and as I mentioned, there is no one kind of answer or magical answer that would answer this.
Now I'm going to bring in Abi in a second on a question that specifically kind of lands on her desk in a way. The question I was going to ask was about one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Abi, that obviously some areas are dispersal areas and some aren't. Some areas, even within that system, accommodate more people than others. And actually, we've had a question on a related topic from Andrew Odom, one of our listeners. Hello, Andrew. And he says, would asylum dispersal work better if the collaborative approach and financial tariffs that are a feature of the Syrian resettlement scheme were adopted more broadly? And I suppose that feeds into what I was going to ask you, which is, how do we overcome some of those practical challenges and political challenges that you mentioned in ensuring that this job of local authorities is spread by more authorities choosing to get involved?
Thank you. And I think the short answer is yes. Whilst clearly as an asylum dispersal area, we don't receive any money, there are other systems and other processes that we've had over the last few years. Unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, for example, Syrian resettlement, which as a local authority we have taken part in. I think the reason though that this becomes a need to be addressed more widely across the system though is, for example, as I said, 1 in 250 people within my city are now asylum seekers. So then when the government comes to me and says, please would you take some unaccompanied asylum seeking children, we'll give you money, I want to say yes, because actually money comes with it. But the challenge is I also have a children's services department that are in intervention too. Plus I have the burden of 1 in 250 people within the city who are already requiring some level of support. Now, clearly as a local authority, we don't have the same control over schools that we used to. We don't have control over the health system, but cumulatively there is a pressure on me and there is a pressure on my partners within the city too. So I think the answer would be yes, to adopt the UASC system or the Syrian system, because interestingly, and probably unsurprisingly, when you look at local authorities who are happy to take part in that, everybody sticks their hands up when there's money involved. And I think that's really sad, and that makes me really sad. I met recently with my colleagues within the West Midlands, the other leaders of authorities, and this isn't a political issue any longer. This isn't about Labour authorities who said yes and Conservative authorities who said no. This is actually about fairness, isn't it? And parity. So I think attaching, as brutal as it sounds, attaching cash to this, I think, would go a long way to redressing the system. As I said earlier, nobody's going to put their hand up at the moment to join me and take some of my burden as a city, which is really sad, isn't it? And I suspect if I was to have that conversation with other local authority leaders, they'd say that, they look at me and they look at the challenges that we have as a result, and they say, why would you do that? There's no financial gain for you. It's not even gain, is it, when there's no financial support for you whatsoever to do this?
And Shaun, what are your thoughts?
I think it's a really interesting point that Abi makes there, and I think there's a wider conversation which I don't want to get too down a rabbit hole about local authority funding, which I don't think we need to go into. But I do. Abby's right. It's not a political discussion anymore. I think we're all agreed that, you know, this is something that we've just got to get on with and do. But I do agree, and actually there's a broader spectrum of stuff. This government, to an extent, has got to step up a bit in terms of the resources it provides to those it expects to implement this stuff. And that goes, you know, in this space, it also goes into other spaces as well. There is a question as to whether, you know, local authorities do a fantastic job in this area. And as I say, have gone, and I know from my own experience in the West Midlands, in Sandwell, that and more broadly, that, you know, really have stepped up in terms of providing that support. But yeah, I agree. I think, quite frankly, we have either got to give the resource to do the job that we're expecting, or we take the responsibility away and actually, you know, it's got to be done somewhere else. But either way, the system as it currently stands, you know, it can't carry on, because it's putting a burden on authorities that ultimately, as I say again, and I'm going to say it, you know, it impacts people. So, you know, I agree broadly with Abby's comments there, and I think we've got to try and find a way to ensure that the practical implementation of this is resourced effectively.
Thank you, Mike. Do you have direct contact with authorities who are thinking about, you know, opting in, for example, or with authorities who kind of need to be persuaded? What's your experience of them?
Well, I mean, I think both Abby and Shaun actually talked very movingly about, you know, both the way in which communities want to welcome people and show they care, but also the practical challenges of doing that. And we don't, you know, nothing in what we're saying is saying that this isn't challenging or difficult. We're just saying we start from the point of view of humanity. For the Syrian resettlement program, we were actually, you know, found it incredibly heartening the way in which counties all over the country, including places that you wouldn't expect, you know, like Worcestershire, or wait, that's wrong to say that you were not the obvious just big city areas is what I'm going. But, you know, from, you know, right the way from Worcestershire up to Skye, we're actually welcoming families as part of the resettlement program, and I think, you know, that's the other thing. And I think there is something about how we share responsibility across the UK and how we share responsibility across Europe, because the numbers, when you translate the Syrian resettlement program of 4,000 people a year into the number of families that every local authority would have to receive, it's a tiny number. It's two or three families. And I think there has to be some accompaniment of funding, and we have to keep the funding challenge in proportion, because the numbers, I completely understand why Shaun raises it about, you've got, if kids going without school meals or whatever it is, and on the one hand, we can't pretend that that isn't an issue, because it is. And as the Red Cross, we care about that as well in terms of the work we do in the UK. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at the other parts of this. And so, you know, I think that when you look at the numbers, that, you know, £1 billion, you know, to support the asylum system, I don't know whether that's a lot or a little. It's a tiny proportion of an economy, a G7 economy that's worth $2.8 trillion or something. You know, and actually the question is, these big numbers that look big in isolation, but actually got to keep them in proportion, and then look at the people behind it and the kind of society that we aspire to be. And I think we actually, all of us on, you know, around this discussion, aspire to be inclusive and compassionate and fair. We also want effectiveness and efficiency, and I would really emphasize that. And I think we need to help local authorities with that as well.
Thank you. Now we've got a few minutes left, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and I'm going to bring two questions together and put them to each of you, related to this question of alternatives that we're talking about. The first is from Sonia Lenigan on Zoom. Hello, Sonia, who asks, has the government looked at the cost of these new proposals compared to investing in the Home Office to provide resource to process claims quickly and fairly? We heard earlier about the number of appeals, for example, that are successful, and issues with the Home Office have been well publicised. And Harry Grimmett on the Party Conference platform asks, how would you propose discouraging people from taking perilous journeys like Calais to Dover? And I think these both touch on the practicalities of this system, where if it's not working by increasing risk or increasing cost or getting bogged down, there come a point at which it doesn't feel like it's serving anybody involved in it successfully. Mike, would you like to come in on those initially, please?
in terms of the first question, we're looking forward to engaging with the government over the next 5.5 weeks around their ideas, development of global resettlement, and then making the case for why creating a fair, efficient, effective asylum system may just, here in the UK is both the right thing to do and is the business-like thing to do. And actually, we think there's probably can be done much more, can be done more efficiently and therefore more, potentially more cheaply. In terms of the whole thing about people undertaking perilous journeys, you've got to step back and look at the starting point of that, as we discussed before. A key to actually the smugglers and traffickers that we see, plying their terrible trade, they're a symptom in many ways of the issues rather than the cause of the issues. Because if there are more safe and legal routes that people can use, be it through family reunion, be it through resettlement programs, be it through a fair asylum system when people arrive, then the reason to use a smuggler or trafficker disappear. And they are making obscene amounts of money out of people in incredibly vulnerable situations. And the key to that is establishing safe legal routes, family reunion, and a fair and efficient asylum system. And that's what we really look forward to working with the government on over the coming weeks, and then beyond that to create something that we can be proud of and create the kind of Britain that we want to be.
Thank you. Ahmad, if I could bring you in on those topics.
I mean, there are really 2 points. The first one is on the resettlement. I think my own experience working with lots of Syrians and also those who support them, I think this has been, an incredible program that has been, that's offered sanctuary to over 20,000 people. I think there are lots of opportunity to expand on this. Obviously, there are some lessons to be learned. The other point I'll say is on the people who are making these journeys. People will always make these journeys. Like, people will always be on the move. Today is Syria. A few years ago it was Iraq or other countries. There will always be a conflict somewhere, and desperate people will always make these journeys. I think the way I see it is that there should be like an efficient system where perhaps a timeline, 3 months, 6 months, the case will be decided, which hopefully effectively, which hopefully would save time and the complexity in terms of appeals and everything attached to it.
Thank you. Shaun.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I think in terms of the efficiency of the investment, I think, again, from what we've seen in terms of streamlining the rules, of ensuring that, as I say, the system more generally in terms of how it operates isn't backlogged. I think that's the biggest issue there in terms of ensuring that we've got a system that operationally functions well. And there is going to need to be a degree of investment into the system to ensure that functions correctly. In terms of the perilous journey point, and actually, I raised this point myself in the House of the Home Secretary the other day about us taking the lion's share of, and what I meant by that was, we do have an area we can control on this to actually protect people, and that's that channel crossing bit. But that requires a bilateral working relationship, and I've been really frustrated by the fact that, from what I've seen, the Home Office has gone over, made those overtures to our counterparts, particularly in the French government, and for all intents and purposes have been dismissed on it. And that is really frustrating, because actually it's the one bit that if we got that bilateral working done right, we can actually save lives. And that's what it comes down to. So I think on the perilous journey point, yeah, completely agree. People are going to make those journeys either way, but we have got the power to ensure that at least for a part of that journey, we can protect people and ensure that they're not having to do that where they shouldn't have to. So I think that's where that work needs to be done, and we've got the power to do that, but we need bilateral cooperation to do it.
And Abby, would you like to comment on either of those?
Yes, thank you. I think fundamentally for me, it's all very well and good talking about what we're going to do moving forward, but the reality is today 1 in 250 people within Stoke-on-Trent are asylum seekers, and we have several thousand who are in hotels who need to be redistributed across the UK. And I think Mike's point around, actually, are we going to put some cash behind this? Is this a priority for us as a political party? Is this a priority for our government to ensure that those individuals, the rights or wrongs of whether they came here, I'm done to as a council leader. That's not my place to make a decision on that. I think fundamentally, the announcements made by the government this week are very welcome, but we actually have a practical today situation we need the government to make its mind up on. And if we're going to do right by people who are here in our city and in our country, then we need to put some cash behind it. So I think there's a higher principled philosophical, you know what I mean? There's a higher question here, really, isn't there, about actually what we're going to do today for people who are here in our country. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, we've got literally 1 minute left and a ton of questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to fit in one more very swiftly from the panel, please. Jeannie Tweedy asks, given the economic issues and the need for integration, I've just lost the full text there, sorry. Given the economic issues, the need for integration, is there a case for allowing people to work while their applications are processed? And to what extent would that help the individuals involved and the communities in which they live? Abi, if I could bring you in first.
Yes, absolutely. I've had the pleasure for the last few years of actually being friends with somebody who's came to the UK a number of years ago, gone through our education system and actually worked for several of our MPs. And one of her biggest frustrations is that at times she has been unable to work. And similarly, I'm contacted by residents who are in the city who wants, as Ahmed, very eloquently said, want to be a part of our society. So absolutely, I think that would be massively helpful. And I think it would also help in those areas where sometimes this is perceived as a challenge. The vast majority of people come here, as again, Ahmed and other speakers have said, from awful situations that none of us would wish to find ourselves in. We should be welcoming people who want to add to the fantastic diversity of our brilliant country by supporting them to engage as soon as possible.
Thank you. Shaun?
I would echo all of that 100%. Yeah, no, definitely. I think we need to be, finding a way to encourage people that want, that come here that do want to work and they want to engage, and most do to do that. So yeah, 100%. I can completely echo those comments.
Ahmad?
Yeah, I second what Abi and Shaun said. I think it's going to be a win-win situation. Mental health, from an economic point of view, integration point of view, language point of view, integration, meeting other people point of view. I think it's a win-win situation.
And Mike, I think I can guess your answer.
Yes, and what's amazing when I go around the UK, see our services, and I meet our volunteers, and I'm meeting people who are surgeons and lawyers and and engineers in our volunteering for the British Red Cross to support refugees and asylum seekers. And I'm incredibly impressed and moved by that, but I also just feel it's such a waste of their talent, both for them and for the UK, actually. And and the focus on integration, again, really looking forward to engaging with the government in the coming weeks around what their ideas for supporting integration are, because that is absolutely key to address some of the issues that we've been discussing, and indeed that Abi has been raising again very powerfully. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. I'm glad we've been able to end at a point where the panel agree across the board on this. I think particularly as a party that prides itself on being a party of work, recently proposed, of course, maybe even renamed the Workers' Party, allowing people to use their skills and capacities and energies for the betterment of themselves is something that as Conservatives, I'm sure we all know, is also produces a betterment for others at the same time. And so I'm glad we're able to end on that note. We've fitted in a huge amount. I'm sure we could, frankly, have continued for another hour on this topic. It just falls to me to say, firstly, thank you so much to the British Red Cross, who we at ConservativeHome are very proud to partner with on this event. Thank you to each of our panellists for giving us the benefit of your valuable time, expertise and insight. Thank you to all of you at home around the country for tuning in to this. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion, and I hope you'll join us for our next event, which starts at 11 a.m, which is Levelling Up, Pan-Regional Partnerships and the Key to Success, where we'll be joined by, among others, Robert Jenrick, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. We'll see you there. Thank you.